bills, and particularly the drug control bill, how is that going to stop some of these corporate organizations from profiteering at the expense of an entire generation of Nigerians?
Well, it does two things. One is it streamlines the policy on drug importation, drug distribution, and over-the-counter management of drugs. It benefits from insights from professional bodies in terms of where the weaknesses exist, and we've tried to bridge those gaps. Second one is that it prescribes massive penalties on anybody, from importers to pharmacies that dispense drugs. It also bans the sale of drugs and restricts areas where they can be purchased. For the quantity of drugs that is available now, common drugs, codeine, tramadol, and related drugs, it's amazing just how much of these drugs exist and how little regulation there is on the ground to deal with them. NDLEA is the frontline agency for this. I don't want to mention figures here because it will shock Nigerians, and I think it will play into the hands of people who make billions from selling drugs. NDLEA is massively understaffed. But I need to mention this because it's important for Nigerians to understand. When we went to Kano, one local government in Kano, which contains the area where about 80% of the drugs, codeine, is processed, packaged, and sold out, has 165 personnel of NDLEA. 165. That's those in the entire state. You had 165 in a state. You have when you sit down with them and talk with them, they will tell you, for instance, that we have 2 operational vehicles. They virtually lack anything to work with. You go to NAFDAC, it's the same problem. So what the Kano Roundtable did was basically to identify massive lack of capacity to deal with this. So you have weaknesses in legislation, you have very low capacity, the manpower needs to deal with this issue just isn't there. We are hoping that there will be strong political will in terms of implementing these laws.
With the laws, with the bills, when they are passed into laws, would they ensure that government funds these institutions as it should?
Well, we would hope so. As you know, that the legislature is only, we are contributing to the solution of a massive national crisis. Hopefully, the government would do this. Starting from this year, one of the, again, fallouts from Kano is the fact that we engaged intensely with the key agencies in terms of what their needs are. We've tried to capture as many of them as possible in appropriations for 2018. If these requirements are captured and funded, we believe we should see a dramatic increase in terms of their efficiencies and capacities. Now, let me say this: legislations aren't enough. The community needs to be directly involved.
I was going to bring you to that because before that report, which everybody talks about, our correspondent went into town, and besides what he reports, besides codeine and tramadol, there's glue, there is marijuana, and then some other things that even fuel, and some things that some kids could just come up with. I mean, pick up a pure water sachet and practically sniff information. So at the end of the day, one wonders how the society, the family unit, the religious unit can help to curb this menace.
Again,
is that also factored into that conversation?
Well, it is. First of all, let's be realistic. There will always be some form of drugs. There will always be someone who will be vulnerable, and someone who finds something that will get them high. What I think is important is to focus on those drugs that shouldn't be here, but are here and available, those that the state and the community can deal with. And that's important. If you don't focus on the hundreds of millions of bottles of codeine that are dispensed with in months, if you don't worry about why it's possible to bring high-potency tramadol drugs into this country in huge quantities, and you don't identify the chains and the weaknesses in the chains, you would get into a situation where the nation says, well, what can we do? Women open toilets, pit latrines and smell it, or young people smell pit latrines and because they want to get high, those who can't afford the money. So I think that it's important to maintain a sense of perspective in terms of this.
The perspective here being how to keep our young people and indeed our citizens away from drugs as much as possible. Well, the question I asked was, how can the society, the family unit, and the religious institutions, the traditional institutions as well, how can they help, besides the bill that the legislature is coming up with? So how can they help to ensure that this menace is put down as much as possible?
I think one is that we need to create a sense of urgency and awareness. Society does need to recognize the fact that the core of society, the family unit, is disintegrating as a result of drugs. Huge numbers of families. There's hardly any family, at least in the northern part of the country where I'm fairly familiar with, there's hardly any family that hasn't been massively affected by a drug problem in one or two or three or four members of family. We know married women who take feeding money, give to their children to go out and buy drugs and bring home to them to take. This is a massive problem. The social values have to be reinvented. People need to recognize the fact that. But listen, the situation, I think people haven't understood that the decay in the social values and social structures at the lower levels of society in this country is alarming.
You know, Doctor, we have heard from the Emir of Kano on this issue, and he has been very vocal about his concern that the family unit, particularly in the north, has been decimated by the absenteeism of fathers. And that, in his view, the children across the north are not receiving the love and the attention and the focus that they need from their fathers. And as a result, we're having some of these abuses, etc. What is your thought on that? And do you believe that there's some veracity to his concern?
Absolutely. I agree with him entirely. In fact, one of the highlights of the Kano Roundtable was the profoundly frank presentation made or speech by the Emir of Kano, where, if you recall, he said, among other things, he believes that every Nigerian needs to go, particularly those who are going to hold leadership positions, needs to go through psychiatrist tests. Yes. And that's, people laughed at it, but the truth about it is that people who are going to lead in this country at all levels, particularly at lower levels, where you need to set standards, you need to be firm in terms of upholding traditional values, you need to worry about what happens to young people who are out on the streets. You need to worry about the number of married women who are involved in drug taking. You need people who will assume responsibility.
But you know, he